We're at the World Business Forum at the Lincoln Center, and we're with Dr. Dambisa Moyo. She's a global economist, and we want to talk to you about what's your impression, what's going to happen in the next few months, maybe the next few years after the U.S. presidential election and after Donald Trump won the election. What do you think is going to be the outcome in general?
So I think that's all a great question. I think maybe what a lot of people have missed is that the United States in particular, but a lot of developed countries and developing countries were already on a trajectory of deglobalization, even under the current administration. What do we mean? The four key pillars to think about: trade. Trade has been on the decline for the last 10 years, according to the World Trade Organization. That's been before a Trump win. In terms of cross-border capital flows, we've seen a reduction of cross-border capital flows. Again, this has happened over the last few years in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Immigration, we have 60 million refugees around the world right now, and of course the influx of refugees over the last 18 months into Europe has brought this issue to the fore, but the 60 million refugees is more than at any other time since World War II. And then finally, the size of government. We know on the Washington Consensus and the ideas around globalization was that private sector would adopt a bigger role in terms of job creation. What we've seen over the last several decades is an increase in the role of government, not just as an arbiter of capital and labor, but also as in terms of the provision of welfare. And so these key pillars, I would argue, are moving in reverse direction. I think a Trump presidency is going to accelerate a lot of those things, but it's not a different shift in terms of where we were already trending. And a lot of that is because we have seen a low and slow economic growth around the world. We've seen many countries in the emerging markets, but elsewhere as well, far below the 7% number that we need in order to double per capita incomes in one generation. So real issues around the global economy, and I think it's unsurprising that we've seen greater protectionism, isolationism, and inward-looking policies from governments around the world.
From your expertise, what would be your advice to nations that somehow depend on a lot of trade with the U.S., or maybe some help? We know that the U.S. supports many emerging nations with some financial support, and Trump has said he would like to retire that, to take out that help. So what would be your advice for those nations, how they can grow their own economies without depending so much on the U.S.?
Well, and that's a fantastic question, because unfortunately countries should have been thinking about that a long time ago. The United States is heavily indebted today. It has a lot of debt. We have seen the decline in real wages and living standards of the average American, which is really why we have the election vote that we've seen this time. People are seeing a deterioration in the quality of life. Real wages have gone down. Average debt, student debt, household debt has increased considerably over the last 30 years. And therefore, life expectancy, issues of suicide, issues around joblessness, the disintegration of family life has become so acute, and we were not paying attention. Public policy was generally not paying attention to that. The United States is heavily indebted. It relies on Japan and China as the two largest lenders. I mean, China is still an economy that is young. It's in terms of its economic success. It's got a lot of its own issues to deal with. So for the United States to be relying on China for debt support, it doesn't really make sense. And therefore, as a secondary piece, for other countries to be relying on the United States, who's borrowing to fund these programs, I think it was always going to be a day of reckoning where countries were going to have to figure out how to stand and compete in a global economy without over-reliance on the United States. I very much hope that there's still a little bit of wiggle room so the transition is smooth. But at the same time, the United States is under pressure. It's not just the United States. I mean, we've talked about the European context as well. These countries that have negative interest rates, they have very significant problems in terms of job opportunities for their own populations. We can't be naive. Coming from places around the world, 90% of the world's population lives in the emerging world. But it would be wrong to be naive and somehow expect that the United States should be funding these programs, because the United States itself has economic challenges that it's not been able to resolve.
Great. Changing a little bit about topics, what would be your advice to leaders on how to advance their projects, their businesses in an era of constant transformation? We live in this beta moment where technologies are affecting every single market. So what would be your advice to them and how to improve their performance in this new world?
It's a great question again, because technology, I think, is the real big piece of the answer for solving a lot of the problems that we're dealing with. whether it's demographic shifts, increases in demography. I mean, India is adding 1 million people a month to its population. Whether it's issues of income inequality, again, I think technology can help to provide opportunities for people who have, traditionally have not had opportunities and therefore could attack issues of social mobility, issues of natural resource scarcity, productivity, debt, the amount of debt that the world is facing. All of these areas, I think we can have a meaningful impact if we start to think about what automation how it can be beneficial, not just for healthcare and education and how we talk to each other in terms of communication and transport ourselves, but also in terms of job opportunities for small and medium enterprises and innovators around the world. There is, of course, with all the good stuff, some real challenges. There are concerns about a jobless underclass. There are approximately 85 million young people between the ages of 18 and 25 who are out of work, according to the ILO. I think if we think about trying to provide opportunities for them, access to capital through the technological era, I think that could be a way forward for the global economy. Because clearly, the traditional way of doing here.
We're looking forward to hear from you later on the main stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.